Hi, my name is Richard Azerga from Microsoft, and in this video we're going to look at how to create and load data into our own data sets in Power BI. And we're going to be able to do this programmatically from a third-party application. So this is big news for different ISVs or organizations that are looking to automate new data sets in the brand new Power BI. So Power BI is supporting a couple of different ways of originating new data. And so if I were to go out to Power BI, really the first option I have is this Get Data button up here. And when I do that, you can see there's a number of different options from an Excel workbook to the new Power BI designer files. But then there's actually a number of different vendors that we can go out and get data from. And we're certainly looking at new partners to bring on to complete this list even more. So if you're an organization that has maybe some really great data sets or some good proprietary data that would be a candidate for this, you really should reach out to Microsoft to see how you might be able to be added to this list. So you can see there's a learn to add your own data here. Now, even if you don't add your name to this list of data sources, you can still push data as a new data set into Power BI, and that's what we're going to focus on today. I'm going to be able to create an application, a third-party application that pushes a new data set into Power BI. Now, when I first learned about this capability, this really started to drive home Microsoft's vision of what we call common consent. And common consent is a term we throw around with Azure Active Directory as being able to authenticate one time, but be able to consume all of the great services that Microsoft offers. They might be services within Office 365, it might be CRM, it might be Power BI in this case, but all of those have a single authentication point, which is Azure Active Directory, and then we can go and get specific, what we call resource-specific tokens to communicate with different services. Office 365 is a really good slide that illustrates this. I'll bring this up here really quickly. This middle pillar in here about connecting to Office 365, that's exactly what we're talking about with common consent. I'm going to be able to authenticate and then work with maybe users and groups, files, mail, calendar. All of these are different things that we have a vision of being able to connect to. And Power BI happens to be one of those things that we're going to be able to connect to with authenticating one time. So in order to do this, I've actually built a third-party application that's going to go out, interact with some data, and ultimately send that into Power BI as a new data set. And the data source that I did as a sample is Yammer. I've done a lot around Yammer analytics, and it's a really, really popular topic. Lots of people are interested in being able to measure their, I guess, return on social investment. And so it's something that I felt like this would be a really cool kind of first example of building my own extension to build data sets in Power BI. So my solution is just a simple MVC app. It's really more of a single-paged application that has some web API endpoints that do most of the heavy lifting. So when the user first comes in, they're going to go to a home controller that's going to make sure they authenticate with Office 365. So we've added connected service to this web project. Once they get authenticated, again, everything is really going to call this web API controller here. So you're going to see that I'm going to be able to do things like get data sets, get a specific data set. I can create data sets. I can delete a data set. Actually, delete is not really supported yet. It's something you have to do in the user interface, but I have it at least stubbed out in here. I'm going to be able to clear a table within a data set, and I'm going to be able to add rows to a table in a data set. Behind the scenes, these are all calling into my Power BI model that's going to do things like get an access token. So the really important thing here, if you've ever worked with common consent, is I need to get a resource-specific access token. And the resource that we use with Power BI is this URI here, this https analysis.windows.net/powerbi/API. So that's the resource ID that we're going to go get an access token for. Once we have that access token, we can simply pass that in the header as a bearer token in all the requests we make out to the Power BI APIs. So here's an example of getting data sets. So you can see I have a base URI that I'm going against, and then I'm saying get data sets. So it's performing a get. Here is an example of getting a specific data set. So it's passing in the data set ID. Here's an example of creating a data set. And so it's doing a post to the data set endpoint. The one kind of interesting thing here is you notice that I've created my own entity that's a Power BI data set. By default, that's going to put an identifier in there. So all this is doing here is removing the null ID, because during a create, I'm not going to have an ID. And so I'm just removing that out of there. Again, I mentioned that delete isn't yet supported, but I've at least kind of stubbed out what that should look like. For clear table, I can go to my rows and I can do a delete async. So I'm doing a delete on the rows of a specific table. And then for adding rows, I'm doing a little bit more of building up kind of a key value pair of my column and my values, but I'm doing a post to the rows. So, you know, the big difference here between the clear is I'm doing a delete to the rows, and here on the add rows, I'm doing a post to the rows. So this would be kind of the web API layer that's really handling all of that. Inside this project, which you'll be able to download off my blog, I also have a kind of a tester view. So if you go under home, there's a tester view that basically just has a bunch of buttons that do test cases. So you can see exactly how to perform all of the different functions. So for instance, here is a create data set. And so it's calling that web API layer and performing a create on that. I have add rows to the data set. So there's examples of all of the different APIs that you can test from within here. But the application is actually going to use a couple of these. So if I were to go to the script, you can see I'm creating a data set. And the data set's always going to have one table called messages. So we're going out to Yammer, we're going to get messages, and we're going to load a data model or data set within Power BI of all these messages. And once we create the data set, we can also use an existing one. So I have a clear data set if we want to start over from scratch and put fresh rows in there. And then you can see I have an add rows. And so all of these are going to be called in various stages of this application that is going to load data into Power BI. So just to kind of show you where we're at, I have one data set. It's this oil and gas demo data set. We're going to add a new data set on the fly using our third-party application that's going to use Azure Active Directory to make all of this possible. So what I'll do is go ahead and run this guy. So you can see the application loading here. And it's kind of a wizard. It's going to walk us through a 5-step process to go and actually perform the export and loading into Power BI. So it's going to force me to log in, and you can see again it's Azure Active Directory. I'm going to go ahead and log in here now. A step you're not going to see is where it asks me to authorize this third-party application that I've built to connect to Power BI. So it's going to show me the permissions that I've requested. So things like that I can, create things inside of Power BI, or that I can, read information that's in Power BI. So that's something you would normally see, but in this case, I've already authorized this application. So now that I've logged in, it's going to bring me into this Yammer export wizard. And so the first step is I need to authorize a second time, really. And the real reason for this is that to this day, Yammer is not part of that common consent. So normally, if I wanted to connect to another service that Microsoft offers, I wouldn't have to re-log in or authorize anything again. I would just have a single time to do that. But as it stands today, Yammer really hasn't fallen under that umbrella. It's a separate thing. And so that's what this is doing. It's saying you need to authorize Yammer. And so I'll go ahead and do that here. So I'll click authorize, and this is going to launch into a Yammer authorize dialog. In this case, it's going to ask me to log in. And this will take just a moment, just because, mainly because Microsoft implements a multi-factor authentication to Office 365. So the first thing I'm going to do is have to provide my credentials, and this is Active Directory Federation Services. You don't have to worry about all this, but ultimately this is Microsoft's login process to Office 365, any of the services that's there. So I'm going to provide credentials, and the next step is it's going to have me verify those on my mobile phone. So I just got a notification on my mobile phone, and I'm going to authorize that now. Okay, so I just clicked authenticate, and here in a second, there you go, it has picked up that, and it's going to tell me in this dialog that the authorization is complete. And you can see in the background, it now has tokens to communicate with Yammer. So I can go and select a Yammer network. In this case, I might select the IT Pro network. I can select a group from here. So I'll select maybe the Office 365 Summits group. And then I can select a date that I want to export data from. So these are really like, think of them as reporting parameters that I've selected. And so I'm going to go and select all these different parameters. Maybe I'll go from the beginning of the year and click next. And now it's telling me what do I want it to do in Power BI. Do I want it to create a brand new data set in Power BI, or do I want to go with an existing data set? So if I were to click existing data sets, you can see I just have a single data set, which is exactly what we saw in Power BI, that oil and gas demo. So I'm going to create a new data set. I could, again, I could go and select an existing data set and either clear it or just append new data to it. So that's kind of the beauty of this model, is we could append data on, you know, a certain duration. Maybe every night we want to go and put new data into this data set. And in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and create a brand new one. So I'll give it a name here. We'll call this Yammer Summit 2015, since we're pulling all the data for the Summit group for 2015. When I click next, it's going to give me just a confirmation that says here's all the parameters for my export, and I can simply start processing. So you want to verify this, but once I click start processing, it's going to go to town doing all the things that it needs to. So before I click start, let me bring up Power BI again, because I want you to see as soon as I start kicking this off, our new data set is actually going to show up pretty quickly. So I'll go ahead and click start processing. So it's in the process of creating this data set right now. So the first step is creating that data set. And actually you can see it there, it just popped up. So that's our process. Now it's actually processing Yammer messages, and Yammer happens to throttle their APIs. So I can't just go and get thousands of records at once. I have to do it at a certain duration. And so that's what you're seeing here, is it's pulling those back at a slower duration than normal. And so I've pulled about 200 messages back now, and it'll continue to do that until I've reached the end of my processing. So it's at 240, 260, and it's going to ultimately go back as far as I've specified for my, and actually there it's done. So it's completed. Now it's saying I can explore my data in Power BI, and it gives me a link to Power BI. So let's actually see what we did here. You know, we have this third-party application. In this case, it's just running localhost, but I could deploy this out to a website. Let's actually see what it gave us. So I'm going to click on Yammer Summit 2015. This is our brand new data set, and you can see we have some data about messages. So I might want to look at users, and let's maybe look at users by the number of likes they get. And here you can see I can get a nice report of all of the different likes, and I can, you know, bring in different views of this. So let's maybe pull in attachments as well, and I can view this in different ways. The other thing I might want to do here is Let's look at maybe the client they used by the number of likes. So we'll look at client by likes, and we can change this report to maybe a pie chart. And this is showing us what client was used to actually interact with Yammer within that group. And we can see by far web is the most frequently used client that's used, followed by, it looks like, iPhone, and then maybe behind that it's Android. So this gives us kind of a neat look into how the interaction occurs within these various groups. So I'm going to move this one down a little bit. And again, I can change any one of these reports based upon the different parameters that I have. I could go and count, the number of threads that I had. There's lots of things that I can do here with, this data set that I created on the fly. So hopefully you can see how this is a really powerful thing that we can do with Power BI. One of the great things is that the Power BI team has created some really great documentation that helped me build this actually pretty fast. So if you go out to Power BI, there's a link. Actually, I'll do it here really quickly. If you go to just the powerbi.com, there's a link up at the top for the Power BI preview that talks about some of the API documentation. And so we'll just really quickly go out there and you'll see some of the things that they've put together. One of those is a place where you can actually go and run and not only see sample interactions with the APIs, but you can even test those out in a console. So this is some of the tools you can get. So as I go down here, if I wanted to look at how to list all data sets, you can see that I can pick the language that I want. So if I wanted to do it in, let's say, Ruby, I can go and see exactly how I might perform this operation in Ruby, and I can even try it if I want, or switch to a console and actually perform those operations live. So they've given you some really great tools to look and see how these APIs are used. So creating data sets, adding rows, querying a table, really all the different APIs that we worked with within this app. And I guess the final thing is that these are all, in order to interact with this, it's all permissions on an Azure AD application. So if I went out to Azure Active Directory and go into my actual directory here in Azure, on the Applications tab, we'll list all the different applications that I've developed for my organization. So there's actually quite a few that are in here. And I'll just pick on one quick application just to show you how I might add the permissions to interact with Power BI. So if I go to the Configure tab on any of these applications on the very bottom, you can see I have a place to give permissions to other applications. This case, it looks like I have some permissions to SharePoint. This is what we call common consent. I can authenticate with this application once and then get access to all these different services. So if I click on Add Application here, you can see some of my other options are things like Dynamic CRM, Exchange if I wanted to interact with things like mail or contacts or calendar events. I can interact with Power BI, so this is what we've been working with here during this video. But I can do things like Azure Active Directory. You can even create your own applications in here so that you can kind of daisy chain these to where one application can have permissions to another. So this is where I would go to add the Power BI service permission. And there's 3 different delegated permissions that I can give an application. And we'll just kind of add this here really quick and look. Is I can do things like view content in here. I can create content, or I can add data to a user's data set. And we actually used all of those. We were able to view the data sets the user had. We were able to create a data set, and then we added new data to that data set. So hopefully this illustrates the things that we can do now with Power BI as a third party to go and put our own data sets, our own data models. And I can do multiple tables. I happen to do one here, but it really enables some really powerful capabilities with Microsoft services. So download the sample and build your own data sets in Power BI. Thanks.